Los saludos más sinceros de mi esposa y del pueblo de los Estados Unidos de América. Muchas gracias por su acogida muy simpática. This is my first trip abroad since Jimmy became president, and I think it shows the importance that Jimmy places on a good relationship with the Latin American countries. He feels very special about that, a very special feeling toward the Latin American countries. And in that sense, I think my trip is a goodwill visit. But I wanted it to be more than that. So since he's been president, I have had a crash course in foreign affairs. I will, before I go home, have been in 7 countries, Jamaica in the Caribbean, Costa Rica, Ecuador. I had never been in Ecuador either. Peru, Colombia, Brazil, and Venezuela before I go back home. 7 countries in 12 days.
From the first day she walked down Pennsylvania Avenue as First Lady of the land, people wondered, just what kind of First Lady will Rosalynn Carter be? Anyone who'd been listening to her during the campaign already knew.
There's so many things I see that I think I can help with. And I learned when Jimmy was governor that I could help with anything. It didn't matter what it was. Sometimes all you have to do is just ask somebody to help you. Nobody ever turns you down. But I also know that I have people back home that are pulling for me, and people in the whole country that are pulling for me and care for me. I've always worked with Jimmy. I know when I started keeping books at the peanut warehouse, I had never kept books, and I studied. It was a real challenge to me. We developed a mutual respect for what each other could do and have a very close relationship. I do read my Bible every night, and I do pray. Before I stand up in front of a group, I just say, I need your help, Lord.
Armed with this kind of philosophy, and hours of Spanish lessons and background briefings, Rosalynn Carter was off to be challenged by a new role. As the president saw her off, he made it clear, as she had, that though this was to be a goodwill trip, there would be serious policy discussions, too. I'm Margaret Osmer. I was one of the 70 people who accompanied Mrs. Carter on her plane. This specially equipped Boeing 707, manned by Air Force officers of the 89th Military Airlift Wing, is Rosalynn Carter's flying office. Grace Vance, wife of the Secretary of State, was in the official party, as well as Robert Pastor of the National Security Council. On the right, Terrence Todman, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. The back of the plane, like the back of the bus, is where we reporters would catch up on our writing from the last stop, our reading for the next stop, and occasionally, our sleep. Jamaica's Prime Minister Michael Manley welcomed Mrs. Carter in person, the only head of state to do so.
On behalf of the government and people of Jamaica, I have the greatest pleasure in welcoming you, Mrs. Carter, and all the members of your delegation. You can be assured that after the long history of friendly relations between the people of the United States and the people of Jamaica, that you will receive the warmest possible welcome in Jamaica.
I bring you greetings from my husband and from the people of the United States.
Certain phrases in Mrs. Carter's welcoming remarks would be repeated at every stop, but she always added a specific message for each country.
By your democratic achievements. We want to consult closely with you and strengthen our ties of friendship as you strive for more social and economic justice. I know that you are aware that what you're doing here in Jamaica has great significance, not only for Jamaica, but for all the developing world. Thank you for letting me be your guest. I look forward to my visit and to my talks later with you this afternoon. Thank you very much.
You know about Mrs. Carter coming to Jamaica?
Mrs. Carter?
President Carter's wife?
No, I have no idea of her. I have no idea of her.
You don't know who she is?
Mrs. Carter.
President Carter's wife?
From United States.
Yes.
I heard about her.
Yeah.
I heard about her.
What do you think of her going to Jamaica?
Come to Jamaica?
Yes.
Well, she may come here to do something for the Jamaicans. She may be able to come and do some good for the Jamaicans.
Jamaica is the only Caribbean nation on the tour and the country most in need of economic aid. Its proximity to Cuba and the close relationship between Prime Minister Manley and Fidel Castro make it of great political importance. Both subjects about which Mrs. Carter is expected to do a lot of talking and a lot of listening. But solutions are for another time. Mrs. Carter would spend over 7 hours in substantive talks with Prime Minister Manley, and there are already indications that those talks will bear real fruit soon.
Hello. I'm so glad to see you. And your name is?
Agnes Harrison.
Agnes Harrison. I'm so glad to meet you, Agnes. You're 101?
Yes, Mrs. The 9th of May.
101. That's good. I'm glad to see you.
Yes,
Costa Rica, the only stop in Central America, the birthplace of the Human Rights Convention, a prime subject during the entire trip. Here, it wasn't the president, Daniel O'Debert, but his wife and the foreign minister who greeted the First Lady, a routine that was to be repeated at each South American stop.
Along, bro. Hurry.
Ecuador was the first of the 3 military governments Mrs. Carter would visit in succession. Here, it's a ruling triumvirate of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. So, 3 wives were on hand at the airport to greet Mrs. Carter. She came prepared to discuss with the leaders the arms buildup in the Andes.
I have come to hear firsthand the views of your national leaders on the matters that face our 2 countries and on the matters that face the international community. At the same time, I expect to convey to your leaders the aspirations and views and thoughts of our new administration in Washington.
In the one demonstration of the entire trip, 150 leftist students in Quito yelled, "Yankee imperialist. Rosalynn Carter, go home." The brief disturbance didn't seem to cause even a ripple in the positive feelings Mrs. Carter was having about her trip. She decided to share her views with reporters on the plane to Peru. She frequently spoke to husband Jimmy during the trip, sometimes more than once a day, but reporters rarely had that chance.
I am so sorry I haven't had a chance to talk with you all late. I haven't even come back to meet the staff that's on the airplane.
Some of these questions you're dealing with are very complicated. Arms, for example, I'm sure is something you haven't been that familiar with in the past. Have you felt entirely comfortable with the knowledge you bring into these meetings to understand what you're taking back?
I think I have. I have really studied the issues that are peculiar to each country. And then I have a book and I write down, usually with pencil, the points that I want to make and a very brief outline of Jimmy's policy on arms transfer, for instance, so that if I do forget it, I'll have it right there in front of me. But it's something that I write down myself so that I can say it in my words so that I understand what I'm talking about. I think they'll understand what I'm talking about. Some things that these heads of state asked me to tell Jimmy in confidence that I would not mention to anybody, but other than that, I have not worried about what I've had to say. Almost in every case, when we start talking with these people, and they say, well, I don't exactly know how to say, I said, listen, you can be blunt. Just be blunt. And after that, they just they're blunt.
How do you keep your energy up, Mrs. Carter?
I really haven't. I was tired the first couple of days, and then when we got to Ecuador, where I am.
In Peru, it was clear that Rosalynn Carter not only knew where she was, but what she was doing. What were billed as difficult conversations with a difficult president about complicated subjects like the arms buildup in the Andes reportedly went well. The First Lady had found her stride.
I had a very long conversation with the president. I talked with him for 3 hours myself. I think the people that were with me maybe asked one question. We did discuss armaments in detail. I will take this information that I have back to Jimmy and discuss with him, but we did have some very detailed, and the Peruvian government is headed toward a government in which all the people in Peru can participate. And the president explained to me his plan, which is called Tupac Amaru, right? And I was very interested in it, and he gave me a booklet outlining the plan, developing a government of participation with all of the people, and I will take this back to Jimmy, and I know that he'll be very, very interested in seeing it. We're going to do all that we can through visits such as mine in a peaceful way to let the countries of the world know that we are in support of human rights of all people everywhere. Our people, all people. We don't want to do anything abroad that our people at home would not like. And I think that's one of the bases of Jimmy's foreign policy.
There were two things that Rosalynn Carter never failed to do at every stop: to see the president and to meet the people in the poorer part of town.
Delicious. The sauce is hot.
This weekend was the first chance for Rosalynn Carter to relax in her first real view of folk art. Having completed her substantive meetings in Lima, the First Lady drove to the resort of Gran Hazul for some private time. But first, there was a party. The foreign minister, Jose de la Puente, Pepe to his friends, and to Mrs. Carter after only 24 hours. He presented her with a sombrero and a poncho. It was during lunch that there was real gaiety. Folk dancers from the Peruvian coast did spirited routines, some of them dating back centuries. Mrs. Carter enjoyed them all. After the meal, Mrs. Carter had some special words for her host.
Feliz cumpleaños a usted.
Oh, thank you.
Happy birthday to the foreign minister of Peru, who was impressed by more than Rosalynn Carter's Spanish.
Although we recognize in her the wife of the President of the United States, but at the same time she's a remarkable ambassador, a real professional. I mean, she's capable, she knows very well the situation in Latin America, in this specific case of Peru. She has entered into a very sincere exchange of point of views with our president, underlying the policy of President Carter with respect to certain fundamental issues like human rights, like a common effort through the contribution of the United States, but as well as the Latin American countries to resolve the problems of the hemisphere.
Were you surprised by her? Excuse me. Were you surprised? Just a moment. Were you surprised by the way she conducted herself?
No, we had read quite a lot about her, but actually she has gone quite over our expectations.
Good morning. How are you? Glad to see you.
Halfway through her seven-nation tour of Latin America, Rosalynn Carter is being called a remarkable ambassador. With each passing day, it's clear that Mrs. Carter is encouraged by her talks, that she is aware of the fact that her visit is having a positive impact. By midday Monday, Rosalynn Carter will be in the center of South America, in Brasilia, capital of Brazil. The trip has gone well so far, but there are challenges to come. In Brazil, for example, there are the sensitive problems of nuclear power and human rights. The second week of her trip, Mrs. Carter arrived in Brazil, her greatest challenge. Relations between the United States and Brazil haven't been good. And although Mrs. Carter's talks with Brazil's leaders went better than expected, the differences remain. Brazilian students and reporters, however, were concerned with human rights in their country. On her second stop in Brazil, Mrs. Carter would take action in that regard that would be the most controversial of her trip.
I want to say how glad I am to be back in Recife. I am so glad to be here and see all of my friends. I've never forgotten the trips that I made and the friends that I made when I was here.
Mrs. Carter would stay again with Mr. and Mrs. Camilo Steiner. Mrs. Steiner speaks of her friend, Rosalynn.
She's a very nice person. She's a person that anyone would enjoy having in their home. She enjoyed being in Brazil. I think she liked the people very much. She made some very good friends while she was in Recife. And she's just a pleasure to have around.
Oh, no, I'm so glad to be back. I'm glad to see you. Yes, and how are you? Good.
In Recife, what had been planned as a quiet, private reunion with friends developed into the most pointed news of the trip. It involved human rights and the story of two American missionaries. Correspondent Bernard Shaw heard their story first.
It happened 4 weeks ago on a Sunday, just before noon. Father Lawrence Rosebaugh of Milwaukee and Thomas Capuana of Schenectady, New York, were pushing a cart. They were headed for this marketplace to get food for poor people. The priest and missionary were arrested, handcuffed and taken to jail and packed into a cell with other naked inmates.
They were just wall-to-wall bodies. It was just like a deposit for bodies is what it was, a very small cell.
We were both beaten up pretty badly. We were kicked in the head, kicked in the stomach, beaten on the head.
The American consulate protested what happened and said the police broke a law which requires a court order to hold anyone incommunicado beyond 24 hours. The governor of Pernambuco State, where Recife is located, had the two police agents involved suspended.
Given the declarations of concern by the Carter administration for human rights globally, if you could, what would you tell Rosalynn Carter?
I had a strong desire to tell her, to share with her our experience, to tell her about some of the suffering, some of the real personal feelings that we saw in guys, to tell her about a certain taxi cab driver that was in that jail cell with us that was crying. He had been there for 10 days and he was telling me a story that he had 8 or 9 kids. He'd been picked up because he didn't have an identity card one day. That he'd been picked up, that he didn't know how long he'd be in there. And this guy, he must have been 45 or so, started to cry. And the tears ran down the stubble that had grown there during 10 days. And I think Mrs. Carter, as well as Jimmy Carter, I think they're sensible people and they can understand that kind of suffering and they would respond in whatever way they could.
Therefore, this is our plea to Mrs. Carter. Please be aware that this is going on, and please ask Jimmy to fight with all that he has to bring about human conditions here in Brazil.
I have a message from them, a personal message. I have listened to their experience and I sympathize with them, and a personal message to take back to my husband. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Colombia, the next to the last stop, is one of the oldest democracies in Latin America, but the country where Mrs. Carter was most heavily guarded. Economic inequities and a high crime rate, accelerated by a growing illegal drug market, have made the capital city one of the more dangerous, something the Colombians aren't proud of. And they took no chances during Mrs. Carter's visit. Venezuela. It's a country with excellent relations with the United States, a leader in the third world, and a bridge between the United States and the rest of Latin America. The second day of her stay here, Mrs. Carter would succumb for the first time. A bout of nausea would keep her from meeting with labor union leaders. Before starting her trip home, the First Lady told ABC News why she thought her trip had been more than a goodwill mission.
I don't think there's anything that I haven't discussed with them that Jimmy wouldn't have discussed with them. I really believe that. They might have negotiated, which I didn't do, but on certain issues. But there were a lot of times that I got, well, just very deeply involved and very specific about the issues, and that can be followed up now.
Rosalynn Carter, Special Emissary of the President of the United States to Latin America. She has obviously enjoyed a successful trip. No one doubts that it has increased the feelings of goodwill between the United States and each country on the tour. But to be considered as more than a goodwill tour, the trip will have to be tested against time and the question of whether there will be any real changes in policy as a result. And whether, if changes occur, the President will clearly indicate that his special ambassador, Rosalynn Carter, played a part. It is clear how the First Lady feels.
I really believe that we can follow up, and I think in the future we're going to see some developments that probably were not expected that come from my visit. I'm very excited about it.
And the President was clearly excited too, happy to have his wife back home.
I'm glad that Jay and I were watching you and Si come up to me last night.